It really is quite a treat to have Steve Coll with us to talk about his new book, Directorate S, which is just out this week. In fact, this is the first time Steve has had an opportunity to do his kind of stand-up talk about the book. Steve, of course, is a legend in journalism for his prodigiousness, the clarity and incisiveness of his prose, his ability to perceive the big picture, and his skill at presenting a grand narrative of something. He spent 20 years at the Washington Post, including stints as a financial reporter, a foreign correspondent, the head of the Sunday magazine, and for 6 years, he was managing editor of the paper. After leaving the Post a decade ago, he served as president of the New America Foundation, then took over as dean of Columbia University's Journalism School. He also continues to work as a journalist on the staff of the New Yorker magazine. And along the way, he's written revealing books about some very big, important subjects, including America's involvement in Afghanistan, the bin Laden family, and ExxonMobil. He's won 2 Pulitzers, one in 1990 for explanatory journalism and another in 2004 for his book, Ghost Wars. That book recounted the CIA's history in Afghanistan from the Soviet invasion in 1979 to just before the 9/11 attacks. And his new work picks up where Ghost Wars left off, examining the past decade and a half of ill-fated U.S. efforts to achieve victory in Afghanistan. Laid out chronologically in rich detail featuring not just American players, but Afghan, Pakistani, and other key figures. The story that Steve tells is a bleak and appalling saga of missed opportunities, mistaken assumptions, misguided strategies, and miscast individuals. There's so much blame to go around, spanning Democratic as well as Republican administrations, and implicating numerous intelligence operatives, military officers, and diplomats. But Steve argues persuasively that what has doomed the American war the most has been the inability of U.S. authorities to understand the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service, and stop its covert interference in Afghanistan aimed at enlarging Pakistan's sphere of influence. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Steve Coll.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you all for coming out. Sorry about the folks standing. I won't mind if you turn around and leave at a certain point. It's warm in here. C-SPAN is with us, so when we get to questions, I'm meant to ask you to come up to the microphone. As Brad mentioned, I haven't given a talk about this book, so you're going to get a pilot, a trial, and I'm going to learn a little bit about what works and what doesn't. I'm going to try to talk for about 25 minutes to leave lots of time for your questions. I'm glad you could come out, in the midst of a stock market crash, resignation of a White House official for allegations of spousal abuse, and the imminent shutdown of the federal government to talk about the happy subject of Afghanistan. So, as Brad said, the title of the book, Directorate S, refers to the covert action arm of the Inter-Servces Intelligence Directorate, the principal Pakistani intelligence service. Although the United States has struggled with ISI's intentions and activity in Afghanistan really from the beginning of its war there after the September 11th attacks, it's not as if ISI was a mystery to the United States, because we collaborated with ISI, the CIA collaborated with ISI during the 1980s to defeat the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. It was during the 1980s, with American and Saudi subsidies, and with the guns and the technology and the power that came from supporting the Afghan Mujahideen during that war, that ISI grew into a state within the state, a corrosive force within Pakistan that began to influence politics as well as regional policy. And it's commanded by the army. The top general in Pakistan is usually the most powerful person in the country, whether directly in power or indirectly. And the service has, maybe about 25,000 people working in it, some career military officers, some civilians. It spies on politicians and foreign diplomats inside Pakistan. It collects intelligence in capitals all over the world, usually about India, sometimes about Pakistani dissidents, military threats. And it's divided into directorates like the CIA is. There's one for analysis, there's one for eavesdropping, and the unit that's in charge of covert aid to Islamist guerrillas such as the Taliban, also other groups fighting in Kashmir, sometimes referred to by the Americans as Directorate S. It's also known as S-Wing or just S inside Pakistan. So the war in Afghanistan that's now in its 17th year, it began in 2001 as a hurried improvisation and counterattack to disrupt Al Qaeda in the midst of real uncertainty in the intelligence community about what could be coming next. They'd missed 9/11. They feared they were about to miss another one. And part of the intention of going in was to disrupt Al Qaeda, to get whoever might be planning a second attack on the run or thinking about something other than that attack. There wasn't really much of a plan for after the war. There was barely a plan to execute the war. And after the fall of the Islamic Emirate, the Taliban government in December of 2001, the question of why we were there and what we intended to do evolved into a series of confused strategies laced with contradictions, sometimes informed by illusions that neither the Bush administration nor the Obama administration proved able to resolve. So one of the central questions in the war all along, for anyone who's been involved in working on it, was why the United States and NATO was willing to accept ISI support for the Taliban, even when Pakistan's covert action and passivity about Taliban sanctuaries in the country directly undermined American interests and cost American lives. There's a character in the book named Chris Woods, who was a CIA officer who eventually ran the counterterrorism center. He was a station chief in Kabul a couple of times. And when he was there the last time, I think that he rotated in around 2011, visiting congressmen and other officials who came out would go in and see him and talk about the war, and it was referred to as his hour of power. And he told everybody, we either address the sanctuary the Taliban enjoys in Pakistan and we win the war, or we don't and we lose the war. It's that simple. And it had seemed that simple to a lot of analysts before him, all the way back to 2006 when the Taliban started to revive. And yet neither administration, neither the Bush administration nor the Obama administration could find the will or the way to address this. So why did we escalate the war after 2006 and yet fail to achieve our goals, and why are we still there? So that's really the subject of the book. It's a narrative about how we got from the eve of 9/11 to where we are today. It has a lot of episodes in it, a lot of characters. One of the sources I was talking to sort of late in the project, in the fact-checking phase, had a sense of what the book's scope was going to be. And he said, we're probably not going to have a Pentagon Papers about this war for a long time. I hope this is the closest thing we have. And I thought, well, that's at least an aspiration for the book and a way to think about it. So I wanted to use my time to talk about four things that I think contributed to where we are today, apart from the kind of central problem or surrounding the central problem of Pakistan and its relationship with the Taliban and the Taliban's ability to access ISI support and geographical sanctuary in Pakistan. One is the problem of war aims, our war aims at different phases. Second is the failure of our relationship with Hamid Karzai and our investments in democratic Afghan politics more broadly. The third is the illusions of our counterinsurgency war in Afghanistan. And the fourth is the failure of American diplomatic and political strategy in the war at various points. So let's talk first about war aims. The Bush administration and the Obama administration carried out more than half a dozen secret interagency reviews of why they were fighting in Afghanistan and how to achieve their aims. A lot of the sessions took place in the same secure conference room on the 4th floor of the Eisenhower Executive Office building next to the West Wing. And the narrative keeps going back to that room. Scenes are remarkably similar, all-day sessions, interagency representation. Often in the morning, the intelligence agencies would come in, the analysts would try to brief the facts. Here's a map. This is what the Taliban controls. This is what the government controls. Here's the demography of the war. Here's our estimates about men under arms. And then usually the professional analysts would leave the room and the policymakers would debate, okay, what do we do now? And it was remarkable to go back and excavate as best I could without access to all of the notes and records, but with substantial access to what was discussed and what was written, what papers were presented, that the problem was so repetitious, and yet the solution was so evasive. And here's an example. In all of the reviews that I was able to really unpack, of course, it's a duty of policymakers sending young American men and women to war to think through, like, what are the vital interests that justify these sacrifices? And in a number of the reviews, they really worked on that problem. And they settled on two. For example, in 2009, during the Obama administration's first review, they essentially found two interests that could justify the sacrifices that were being contemplated. One was Al Qaeda and its affiliates, because of the threat across borders of additional terrorist attacks beyond those that were already evident. And the second was this less publicly pronounced usually because it was so sensitive, but the security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons. Country with 100 nuclear weapons, dozens of terrorist groups. You don't want them to fall in the wrong hands. Okay, so Al Qaeda and Pakistan nuclear weapons. But remember, it's 2009. Neither of these problems is actually located in Afghanistan at that time. Al Qaeda had left Afghanistan and gone to Pakistan. What remnants survived the US campaign in the fall of 2001. They had not only gone over to Pakistan, they'd lashed up with local groups and inaugurated the worst years of domestic terrorism that Pakistan has ever known, destabilizing the country. And of course, Pakistan's weapons were not in Afghanistan. Notwithstanding this mismatch, the surge of troops, 100,000 US soldiers at the peak, 150,000 international soldiers counting NATO contributions, was sent to Afghanistan because of the rationale that if Afghanistan fell apart, if the Taliban triumphed, Al Qaeda would come back, which was a plausible concern, but a rather indirect way to define war aims. And the second problem in this review was one that recurs right to the present day. All right, Al Qaeda, we agree, a menace, a threat, a relatively finite group, membership, under 2,000, at least in the region. But the Taliban, are they an affiliate of Al Qaeda? Are they as dangerous to the United States as Al Qaeda? On what basis? They didn't participate in the 9/11 attacks. It's not even clear from the best scholarship that the leadership of the Taliban knew about the 9/11 plot. Obviously, they were complicit. They had created sanctuary for Al Qaeda. They refused repeated requests to do something about Al Qaeda. But after the fall of the Taliban government, what did the reviving Taliban pose by way of a threat, direct threat, across borders to the United States or its allies? This was a question that all these reviews in that conference room on the 4th floor of the Eisenhower building could never settle. President Obama knew one thing: he didn't want to fight a forever war against the Taliban. Bob Gates, the defense secretary at the time, a holdover from the Bush administration, he pointed out, the Taliban are part of Afghanistan. We're not in a position to fight a long war against them. The Pentagon wanted to fight a war against them, but It wasn't able to persuade many of the civilian decision makers, including those like the Secretary of Defense, that it had a plan that made sense in terms of the cost and the outcomes that were likely to be achieved. At one point during these reviews in this building, they got into an argument about, well, have we ever said that we wanted to defeat the Taliban? I'm not sure that we have. And the next day, the Pentagon came back with a big PowerPoint deck putting up all the statements that different officials had said over the years saying, we're going to defeat the Taliban. And they said, okay, well, I guess we have to say something. Eventually, they came out of that review with a plan to degrade the Taliban and reverse its momentum, language that is so strikingly vague as a war aim that it just kind of begs examination. I mentioned that these reviews returned to the vital interest of the security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons. I think that was also a fairly easy consensus to reach. But what did it imply? It meant that the stability of Pakistan and the military's control over the country's nuclear facilities was crucial. So the more violent the American-led war in Afghanistan became, the more it clearly destabilized Pakistan, spilling violence over the border, pushing Al Qaeda into Pakistan, and touching off, as I mentioned, after 2007, the worst years of internal terrorism the country had ever known. So you have dozens of militant groups, more than 100 nuclear weapons, and a worsening war. Now you recognize that Directorate S is part of your problem in Afghanistan, but what can you do to pressure it when you're so constrained? You've already destabilized Pakistan. And if you go in heavy with pressure, you're only going to make this situation worse. During the last review of the Bush administration, late 2008, President Bush approved the kind of analysis that was more or less along the lines that I've just described at a National Security Council meeting. But he pointed out, he said, we're suggesting the Obama administration that they increase resources to the war in Afghanistan, but everything you're telling me is that the problem is in Pakistan. Isn't there more that we can do? And the CIA says, well, we can do drone attacks across the border. They'll make some difference. But the real problem is in Quetta. The real problem is in Karachi. The real problem is in the heart of Pakistan. The president says, well, can we go there? And Michael Hayden was then the director of the CIA, and he says, sir, blowing buildings up in the middle of one of Pakistan's major cities is a lot different than an isolated mud hut getting struck out in the mountains somewhere. They were constrained. President Obama could not figure out how to resource the war against the Taliban enough to win it, or, on the other hand, how to define his war aim so narrowly to focus only on Al Qaeda that the Taliban problem could be evaded. They went forward with this plan to reverse the momentum and degrade the Taliban because they knew that pursuing a military defeat of the Taliban was implausible. Hamid Karzai. So it's become fashionable, I think, to think about Karzai as someone who turned out to be unstable, consumed by conspiracy theories. There's no question in his behavior in private was often unbalanced. The book describes this again and again. There was a scene, though, where Karzai goes walking in the garden with one of his ministers, and the minister says to him, Mr. President, I do think the Americans have been unfair to you. Initially, you were an Afghan Mandela. Now, all of a sudden, you're an Afghan Mugabe. That's not right. But one of the threads in the narrative is how this relationship unraveled from the Mandela years forward. And one of the things that, even as someone who was going there a lot as a magazine reporter, felt kind of like a beat reporter on the war, had interviewed Karzai a couple of times, one of the things that really struck me when I went back and tried to unpack this, meeting by meeting, year by year, documenting as much of what was said in private as I possibly could, that every time Karzai received an American visitor, almost from 2004 until the last day that he was in office, the first and last and most emphatic thing he said was, you got to do more about ISI. You got to do more about Pakistan. The war is over the border. And over time, he could not understand why the United States was unable to address this problem. He took it for granted that the U.S., as the world's supreme military power, could force ISI to stop aiding the Taliban if it really wanted to do so. And since the U.S. did not take this action as the years went by, his thinking sunk into conspiracies. He figured there had to be another explanation. Eventually, he concluded that the U.S. was secretly hoping that ISI would destabilize Afghanistan so it could justify keeping long-term military bases in the country. There's a diplomat in 2013, James Dobbins, who's a special envoy. He goes to visit Karzai. Karzai rolls this theory out on him again. It's not the first time an American's heard it by now. And Dobbins says something to the effect of, you know, Mr. President, by now you've got the Snowden documents, you've got the WikiLeaks materials, literally millions of pages. Can you see in these documents any trace of this plan? And Karzai says, maybe you don't know the plan. That there's a deep state in America. Another episode that is very dispiriting to recount in kind of the fullness of that this kind of retrospective reporting allows was the 2009 election debacle. Remember, this was when Hamid Karzai was reelected. Richard Holbrooke came in and was meant to be the special envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan. He was immediately estranged from the White House. Obama didn't appreciate his style. But he thought that the diplomacy around the election was his lane in Washington lingo, and he was going to try to shape this election. He used to say that diplomacy was like jazz. It's a little bit of improvisation that's required. And he started to move toward the election date by basically talking to as many potential alternatives to Karzai as he could identify. There's a scene where he runs into a brother of the late Ahmad Shah Massoud in Kabul, Ahmad Zia. And Ahmad Zia says, you know, I think I'm the only person in Kabul who you have not invited to run against Karzai. I should feel insulted. And Karzai, of course, got wind of this almost immediately. And he became understandably upset and paranoid that the Americans were out to overthrow him. But Holbrooke had no authorization from the White House to replace Karzai, and he had no plan to actually achieve the goal. And to make an episodic and quite vivid story short, we end up with the worst of both worlds in this case. Karzai is reelected, and he believes with reason that the United States is out to get him. And he's infuriated about that, and it shapes, along with his befuddlement about our inability to coerce Pakistan into changing its conduct, his growing estrangement from the U.S. I mentioned this walk with the minister, the same one where they talked about Mugabe and Mandela. Karzai says to his colleague, you know, if we can't run the government, this is after the election debacle, after all these pleadings that the U.S. has not responded to. He says, you know, if we can't run the government, we should bring the Taliban back to punish both the Americans and the Panjshiris, he says, referring to the Northern Alliance. His son, Karzai's young son, Mir Weiss, happens to be with them. And the minister asked, do you want this boy to grow up under a Taliban regime? I don't want that for my son. If the government collapses, he said, the U.S. will not be threatened, but we will be wiped out. And that is what kept Karzai on side, barely, the knowledge that they were a dependency. And it infuriated him more and more as time went on, that he had become, on the one hand, the Americans who visited him would tell him, you are the sovereign president of Afghanistan. We respect you, and we will deal with you as a sovereign. And on the other hand, every time he objected to American counterinsurgency doctrine or its policies, military campaigns, or the way that they had gotten involved in the election, he was ignored. And he understood that he was powerless, despite this loose talk, which was repeatedly offered to his aides and sometimes to the Americans, of changing sides, cutting a deal with ISI, bringing the Taliban back. He couldn't act because he wasn't in a position to do so. All right, I've got just maybe 5 or 6 minutes left, and two other things I wanted to touch on. One was the counterinsurgency campaign that began in 2008, 2009 in earnest. When Obama took office, and after a series of very tangled reviews, partially endorsed the recommendations of his commanding general, Stanley McChrystal, to carry out a counterinsurgency campaign, decided at the same time in December of 2009 to announce that he was ordering an additional surge of troops into Afghanistan, but he also announced the date when they would withdraw. So we're going in and we're going out, kind of a paradoxical announcement, so typical of these strategy reviews and the policy throughout. But as a counterinsurgency campaign, the Afghan war in 2009 created a real math problem. So in counterinsurgency doctrine, the typical idea is that you need a ratio of 20 soldiers and police for every 1,000 local inhabitants. In Afghanistan, that would have required as many as 600,000 security forces, which was an unrealistic number, even involving the rapid buildup of Afghan security forces. So they narrowed the problem by confining the counterinsurgency war to 80 key terrain districts. These were districts in Taliban country, selected from the south and along the border with Pakistan. And this whole formulation soon became a kind of overdetermined engineering diagram. It birthed a jargon-filled language of acronyms and district stability frameworks. Pentagon briefers would exclaim slogans such as, "It's great to make sure the population is attached to the government." And the mantra of clear, hold, build, transfer, meaning transfer territory rid of Taliban influence to a legitimate Afghan government and its security forces, was an illusion. The entire sequence of hold, build, transfer was based on wishful thinking. The British envoy working with Holbrooke advised very early on. The way the White House war czar Doug Lute put it was to Obama around this time was, he said, Mr. President, you can send a battalion of U.S. Marines not only anywhere in Afghanistan, but literally anywhere in the world, and they'll clear an area. And as long as you're willing to keep them there, they'll hold it. The problem is handing the cleared area to the Afghans and doing something with it. Finally, I just want to mention the problem of politics and diplomacy. Here's another contradiction that just keeps recurring in the narrative when you kind of unpack the phases of our experience there. So one after another, America's top generals, they arrive to command the war in Afghanistan, and they'll say in public, explaining their plan to the Afghans and to the American people, that peace cannot be achieved in this war by military means alone. And yet, year after year, military strategy is by far the greatest priority. I think it was David Petraeus during his tour in 2011 who said, you can't capture and kill your way out of an industrial strength insurgency. These wars end through negotiations. And the War Cabinet in the Obama years, repeatedly affirmed that there would have to be a political solution that accommodated at least some elements of the Taliban and Afghan politics. But if the Afghan war could be settled only by negotiations that incorporated at least as many defectors from the Taliban as possible, why was this line of political and diplomatic action not prioritized year after year? This was a stovepiped war. Pentagon ran its war, the CIA ran its war. Richard Holbrooke, who was estranged from the White House, was told to run his diplomacy. It was not a whole of government, political, or diplomatic strategy by any stretch. And when I went back through all of this, I was present when a lot of this was going on and, building my diaries and interviewing people in real time. But when I went back and unpacked this particular failure, I found it particularly frustrating. Because when you think about the Obama administration's achievements in diplomacy, holding Russia and China and Europe on side to negotiate a 10-year standstill agreement with Iran over its nuclear program, talk about a hard problem. They got it all the way to the finish line. They decided to reverse decades of policy toward Cuba, despite the treacherous politics in the United States. They worked on it, sometimes in secret, sometimes in semi-secret, and they got it done. And yet here, where we had all these soldiers on the battlefield, 2,000 plus dead, 20,000 wounded, so many limbs lost, and we didn't bring our best game to this politics, this negotiation, this, no matter how treacherous, no matter how difficult. It was a war that was running almost on automatic pilot in a lot of ways. The book tells the story of the conflict resolution cell that was set up in 2010 with the president's strong endorsement in the White House to try to secretly negotiate with the Taliban, to try to bring the war to an end. And it was a significant effort, and it's a fascinating story, who they were negotiating with on the other side. You know, these moments when Tayyib, the Taliban negotiator, comes and brings a letter from supposedly from Mullah Omar on Taliban stationery for President Obama. The letter says, you know, Mr. President, I've had to make some difficult decisions with my people to let these talks go forward. Now you should step up and show a little courage. Let's negotiate. The talks failed for a number of reasons, one of which was Hamid Karzai was not connected enough to the U.S. To participate as a constructive partner in them. Another was ISI, which wanted to control the talks, but the Taliban didn't want the ISI as a negotiating agent. Not to suggest this was going to be an easy process, but it didn't, when you read how it unfolded, it did not represent the best capacities or traditions of American diplomacy. And the stakes yet were so high. So I'm anxious for your questions. So I think I will just wind down. One thing that hasn't changed in the war is ISI's role. There's in August of 2016, so just as we were getting ready to turn the war over to the third administration to fight it, there was a unmarked white helicopter that went down in Logar province. It's an area that Steve Levine will remember. I think we've both been there. It was like the main ISI supply route into Charsiab and up into Kabul because it was shielded by all these high ridge mountains. You could basically drive a truck from Pakistan to about, 40 clicks from Kabul without ever kind of breaking cover. And that's where the helicopters would also fly. So this helicopter crashed, and it had a Russian pilot and some people from Pakistan on board and a bunch of supplies. The Taliban surrounded it, hustled the pilots and all of the passengers back to Pakistan, burned the helicopter, and disappeared with the supplies. The Afghans said, this looks like an ISI operation. Pakistan said, no, the helicopter was flying to Central Asia for repairs. So the Trump administration has come in, and they've certainly taken a tougher line on Pakistan. They've suspended aid. They've tweeted aggressively. We have, 10 to 15,000 troops on the ground, 1/10 the number that we had when at the peak of the Obama surge. The book describes this exercise the CIA's war analytical unit would do every 6 months called the district assessments. These color-coded maps of Afghanistan's 400 and plus administrative districts, one color indicating government control, another color indicating Taliban control, another color indicating contested or local control. And the maps were a big hit because they were really fun to look at. They kept unfurling them on these tables in the Eisenhower office building. They'd update them every 6 months. And throughout all this history, from the beginning of from the end of the Bush administration through the 150,000 troop peak to the withdrawal of U.S. Forces and the prioritization of Afghan security forces in the lead of combat to today, the essential picture on those maps has not changed. The war is a stalemate. It's a stalemate because the Taliban can't achieve their objectives. They don't have an air force, and they don't have any way to defeat the U.S. Air Force. And anytime they mass They make themselves instantly vulnerable to American air power. That's why they haven't been able to take significant cities, even though they've sometimes had momentum. And the US and its Afghan partners have not been able to substantially change Taliban control of the countryside in the areas where it's particularly strong. The things move around on the map, but the essential picture of the war has stayed the same. So we're in our 17th year. And when the next president is sworn in, or this president is sworn in again in January 21, my sense is we'll still be in this war. So thank you for listening.
So if you could give advice to the next president, since giving advice to this one doesn't seem to do anything except upset him, what would you suggest? I mean, this isn't the first time. This sounds like Vietnam all over again in some ways.
Look, it's hard enough just to try to tell you what happened. I really am sort of not. I'm kind of reluctant to give people advice about this history, but I think the common sense, a couple of common sense answers. If you look at a lot of history of war, especially long stalemated wars like this one, a natural response would be, not to keep doing the same things over and over again and expect different results.
Right.
I think the Trump administration, for example, has persuaded itself that what it's doing differently is withholding aid from Pakistan, showing resolve, we're going to stay until the last terrorist, loosening the rules of combat, even though there are many fewer forces that were there when the war stalemated in 2011, and that somehow this kind of resurgence of willpower on the battlefield will lead to some kind of capitulation by the Taliban or Pakistan. And I just don't see what the evidence is for that hypothesis. It's a feel-good posture that you can take.
For him.
For him. Well, and look, I like everyone who's been to Afghanistan, who's worked in Afghanistan, I have nothing but empathy for the Afghan people, for this constitutional government, for the Afghans who came home in 2002 to kind of restore their country that had been destroyed by the Soviet invasion and the wars that followed. Afghanistan was at peace with itself and its neighbors for most of the 20th century. The restoration that took place in 2002 was not imposed on it by the international community. It was an Afghan effort to recover their country. They still have a constitutional government. It is factionalized. It is cracking up. It is still there, though. They control the cities. There's a young population that's come of age in those cities that's connected to the world. It's a different Afghanistan than any before it. And I wouldn't want to see that collapse. So, I'm not suggesting that we pack up and go home, but to try to get from here to a better place, to reduce the violence, even if a political settlement is a quixotic goal, the purpose of negotiations and diplomacy in an environment like this is to reduce the violence, to give space, to give breathing space. And the only way that's going to happen is if the powers that shape events in Afghanistan, besides the United States, China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, you can go on, India, are part of an effort to achieve what is in fact the common interest of a more stable, less violent, less toxic, less terrorist-infested Afghanistan. That's hard work. That requires high-level diplomacy, the kind of diplomacy that the Obama administration carried out in the Iran deal, that the first Bush administration carried out in the context of the first Gulf War. It's an all-in, all-day kind of project, using all of the levers that the United States has and with allies. So the remarkable thing is we haven't really made that effort around this war since the Bonn Agreement. We did then. And so I guess I would start there, because it can't be worse than where we are now.
Sounds good.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Dan.
Rather than look forward, let's look backwards then. You spoke at the very beginning about missed opportunities, and especially with ISID. I'm wondering, what are the tools that you think the United States had that could have leveraged ISID to do something differently than what it did? I reflect back on the failure of our withholding F-16s, as you recall, and how they gathered dust out in Arizona. I mean, that wasn't a very effective lever in the end. So I'm wondering, what are the levers you would identify?
Yeah, I mean, they're different at different times of the story. I mean, counterfactual history, I think, is kind of a fool's game, but you can't help but think about the question, where were the most significant missed opportunities? In my mind, they were in the period 2002 to 2004, after the Islamic Emirate fell, after the Taliban leadership melted into Pakistan. Afghanistan was relatively peaceful. Many Afghans came home to rebuild. The international community was united in support of the constitutional government created at Bonn. And what happened? We turned immediately to Iraq. There's a scene in the book where the generals who are sent to Afghanistan summer in 2002 to stand up a task force. Yeah, it's lightly resourced. Rumsfeld is determined not to permit large-scale military or reconstruction aid in Afghanistan because of his belief that we're not nation builders. But these generals go off, get called to a conference in Brussels while they're just trying to get organized for what peacekeeping they can consolidate in Afghanistan. And they come back and they say to their colleagues, oh, we're going to war in Iraq. This is, May, June 2002. And of course, the incentive structure inside the military, inside the intelligence services immediately shifts. This is where we're going now. So that's one thing that happened. The other thing that happened is that we had no plan to account for the defeated Taliban in the politics of the Bonn Agreement. Okay, after war, what is the wisdom of victory? It is to try to reconcile with as many of the defeated enemy as possible, as we did in Germany, as we did in Japan. Yes, you can hold leadership accountable, you can identify war criminals and hold them accountable, but the foot soldiers, the lieutenants, there has to be a plan. We made this mistake twice, once in Afghanistan and again with the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. And the consequences in Afghanistan were that our policy was, despite some arguments that I am able to document in the book to the other side, offering an alternative to this, was that any Taliban foot soldier was a candidate for Guantanamo. And we would call people to meetings, say, well, let's talk about politics, and then we'd arrest them and put them in jumpsuits and send them away. And then the third thing, after a couple of years of this combination of neglect and harshness, I think there's a study that I describe in the book from the spring of 2006 when Amrullah Saleh, who led the Afghan intelligence service at that time, he sees the Taliban coming back and he decides to do a kind of a field study of what's going on and what are their motivations, where are they going. Describes how he goes out into the provinces and he pays Taliban commanders to come in and talk to him and submit to interviews. And in Afghanistan, there's really no impermeable lines. People will cross and talk to each other. And he concludes that ISI is supporting this resurgence for a couple of reasons. One is that Afghanistan has by now consolidated its constitutional government. It had a successful presidential election in 2004. It has parliamentary elections. It has the international community support. And it's looking like a long-term ally of India with international backing. And remember the other signal we sent to Pakistan during this time. We signed this big civilian nuclear deal with India, in which we essentially forgave India for breaking out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, promised them long-term strategic partnership. And then we turned around and said to Pakistan, you don't get this deal. You're never going to get this deal. You're the country of AQ Khan. You're not reliable enough to have it. It's clearly evidence that in the Pakistani high command around that time, Musharraf and his corps commanders start talking to themselves saying, first of all, Afghanistan is becoming an ally of our enemy. Second of all, the Americans don't believe in us as strategic partners. They are making a long-term commitment to India. And third, because of the Iraq War and our decision not to invest heavily in Afghan reconstruction and security after 2002, we turned the Afghan security operation over to NATO allies in order to free up our forces to fight in Iraq. So the Pakistanis look across the border and they see the Canadians coming into Kandahar. They see the Brits coming to Helmand. They see the Dutch coming to Uruzgan. And they say, this is not serious. We're already in a post-American Afghanistan. We got to get going. And so that was, I think, where the ISI kind of revival of the Taliban was located, in some combination of those factors.
So you've not identified any specific levers that would have impacted the
strategic level. I think strategic.
policies.
I think you would have had to incorporate Pakistan into a post-war politics. You would have had to incorporate them into a wiser approach to the post-war settlement. Now, there are coercive policies that you could try to bring against ISI officers and specific individuals, travel sanctions, those things. We may see the Trump administration try some of this. It was argued about at various points in both the Bush and Obama administration, especially Obama administration. But the record of sanctions in the 1990s and the depth of Pakistan's relationship with China, to me argues that that kind of coercion by itself, if it's not coupled with some kind of negotiation involving Pakistan's patrons or other regional powers, it's not going to succeed. Yeah,
Evening, Steve. Evening, Steve. Thank you for coming. I want to shift gears for just a second with a quick question. Can you be induced to do a combo Ghost Wars Directorate S on Iraq from July 1991 through 18 March 2003?
No.
No? Okay. Thank you, sir.
A question I have is, you touched on it, I guess, 12 years as to what it wanted 12 years ago. Is what does ISI want? Is there a way that we can accommodate it now? Because it sounds like, in a way, this is a redux of what the U.S. was facing in Vietnam, where the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese used Cambodia. And what Nixon did then was bomb the hell out of regions of Cambodia and Laos. I don't think that's something the U.S. will do. It sounds to me like Pakistan is trying to have it both ways on the war. It's charging the U.S. for ferrying supplies into Afghanistan, and it's also benefiting by, I guess they're probably getting something from the Taliban, having them in the country and being free to go into Afghanistan. I'm wondering they're the closest to Afghanistan, essentially, except for Iran. What can be done to try to accommodate them?
Well, this is a big part of the story in the book, especially during the Obama administration. There's, there's in very close conversation with the head of the Pakistan Army, who's a kind of character in the book, Ashraf Kayani. Again and again, the Americans are saying to him, well, what do you really want? What's good enough? Because after all, it's not about just the United States and Pakistan. Afghans have to buy into whatever political settlement is stretched after the Bonn Agreement is made. Afghans are talking to Afghans about what kind of settlement might work internally, but Pakistan's involvement as a spoiler makes it very difficult to have any kind of clean negotiation. And what the answer is that in these conversations, at one point kind of writes a secret paper, he hands it to Obama and says, this is what I want. The Americans look at it and essentially says, I want an adequate amount of political influence in Afghanistan and space for Pashtuns, whether they're Taliban or non-Taliban, to participate fully in Afghan politics. We feel that we don't have that yet. No, the Afghans would say, the hell you don't. But at least it was a sort of sense that they backed off of their claim of saying, we don't want total control. We don't want the Taliban back in power. We just want a better political settlement. So that was one thing. But also on the list were a bunch of other things. We want access to, we want a free trade deal with the United States. We want the civilian nuclear deal you gave India. We want your support on our goals in Kashmir. We want your investment in our water disputes with India. We want our energy deficits addressed. We want you to, holistically embrace us the way a true ally would. If we were, in trouble in Germany or the UK, you would come in with the IMF and you would fix all this. And, the Americans looked at this paper and they said, wow, okay, honest talk, but this is impossible. And before they could even really digest it, you hit 2011, Raymond Davis, Osama bin Laden, and the whole relationship collapses. So, it's not as if these questions haven't been grappled with at a sophisticated level, but they were never, sort of dealt with in a whole. They were always kind of fraught and isolated discussions, even at the highest levels.
Congratulations on the book. I want to ask you a question about craft. You acknowledged that you were writing about a war that is still ongoing, and you referenced an anecdote between Ambassador Dobbins and President Karzai. How do you go about researching and writing a book like this, and which documents are you waiting for their declassification date in the future?
Well, I mean, I only know how to do these things one way, and that's why I always produce these very, very long books. I've got to figure out how to write 100,000-word books instead of 220,000-word books, but I just can't figure it out. But I know my reporting methodology is a combination of first and foremost interviewing, second, documents that I can obtain from original sources that provide ballast for chronology, specificity, contemporaneous authenticity of what was said, what was done. Third, other documents that I can obtain through declassification or through resources like WikiLeaks or other subjects. State Department cables were in fact pretty helpful for the chronology because they're very granular about dates and kind of themes. And when I was interviewing or when I had access to my own original written sources from my own original sources, I could always kind of backstop those against that record. It was helpful in that way. And then the fourth layer is just all of the scholarship, all of the books, all of the analysis that's out there, try to absorb it all. It doesn't usually turn up in the pages except in kind of regurgitated through my own kind of thinking and framing of things. But I read, I try to absorb everything. And it's, this book was, maybe 10 years in the making.
And what would be the thing that you're waiting for?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of episodes where I was able to surround something through interviewing some, contemporary documents of various kinds, but where there were disputes about what really happened that I couldn't resolve. I'm going to give you a simple one that I think, may come out with more documentation earlier than others. This whole episode of Tora Bora when bin Laden escaped, okay? I mean, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee did a pretty good investigation. It was almost entirely based on interviews. That's probably the most thorough account that you have of kind of why we didn't go up and block bin Laden from escaping into Pakistan. And could we have finished the war against Al Qaeda's leadership that early? Would it have made a difference? I don't know, but why didn't we finish it? That was why we were there. And we didn't lift those troops up there. And there's kind of an oral history of, woulda, coulda, I said we should have done it, different people saying, I argued we should have gone, other people saying, no, you didn't actually. And I really felt like I tried to give you the best account of what happened and what the factors were that I could based on my research. But I felt like, this is something that could be settled if you would just give me the documents. And there's a bunch of things that are very specific. I think it's kind of, important to our understanding of the history of the war.
I'd like to go back to one of your earlier books, the one on ExxonMobil, Private Empire. You wrote about Tillerson when he was in his own world and the most successful person in that world. What do you think is happening with him, has happened to him, and where he goes from here?
I'm not a State Department beat reporter anymore, but when he came in, I thought that he would do better than he has done. I could see where his problems were going to arise, at least a few of them, and they have borne out. One is, when you're the CEO of ExxonMobil, you live in a bubble. You're always flying private planes. Everyone around you is supporting your leadership. Everyone is telling you what you want to hear. No one challenges your opinion. You're the boss. We all know the secretaries of state are not the boss. They have to compete with the White House for influence over foreign policy. And with this White House, even if it had been, James Baker, it would have been a pretty challenging job. But one of the ways that secretaries of state gain influence in an administration, in my experience, is by using the bully pulpit that the secretary has distinctively after the president to speak for the United States, to just stand up and say, this is what I think. You have so many opportunities. Yeah, you can clear your speeches, but you're also in front of the microphone a lot. And it's not unusual to have a Secretary of State who's fighting with the White House or isolated from the White House. I mean, think of Clinton and Obama after all the bad blood of that campaign. But the way you overcome that from foggy bottom is you stand up and speak. You make yourself felt. You kind of create facts through your own activity. Well, Tillerson was never a public communicator. He never played that role. He never answered questions from the press that weren't super controlled. He never thought about communication as three-dimensional chess, where you're speaking, with allies. You're not just speaking to your counterpart, which is what an oil company does, right? You negotiate with the leader of a country or the leader of another oil company, one-on-one, and that's all it is. But in diplomacy, we live in a world of allies that are also democracies. You're speaking not just to their governments, but to their parliaments, to their publics, to your adversaries. This is a lifetime's work. And then the last thing I would say is he came into government, unlike other executives who've come from the private sector into government, without any prior experience of government. George Shultz ran Bechtel, but he had been in and out of government a number of times before he became secretary. And, at ExxonMobil, they tended to regard the government as a hostile entity. The U.S. government, they were very explicit that they thought the State Department wasn't very good. It was full of anti-oil career diplomats, that they didn't negotiate very effectively. And so to come in and take over a diplomatic service that you don't have experience with and that you don't necessarily respect is a prescription for what we've seen.
Thank you.
Good evening. So when you were doing research and conducting interviews for this book, what did your access to ISI officials look like? If there was any, did you find them forthcoming, or do you think there was any attempt to mislead you?
Mislead me? I would refer you to the footnotes because I don't really want to get into a qualitative discussion about my sourcing. But one of my goals was I try to provide as much transparency as I can, consistent with my commitments to my sources in the footnotes. But one of my broader goals, which was, it's true in Ghost Wars too, I'm not saying I got all the way there, but it was really something I thought about every month that I was working on this project. I wanted to provide equal empathy to the perspectives of decision makers and characters in all three of the countries that I was writing about. So I didn't want the Pakistani characters to be any less full, any less listened to, any less understood than the Americans. Inevitably, with systems, I understood the American system better. But I've spent a lot of time in Pakistan, and I understand, something of the way things really work. But what I could really do is to make sure I understood the people and their institutional kind of setting and the way they saw the world, and why they took the decisions they took. And I tried to do the same, in Afghanistan as well. I think the place where I struggled the most was with the Taliban. I think a great book about this war would bring the Quetta Shura to, sort of intimate life the way, I could get the Pakistani Army's high command humanized and brought up in a big, vivid way. I thought but Mullah Omar was not available for an interview.
Thank you.
One more question.
Thank you. This is Ahmed from Pakistan. I am a scholar in National Defense University. From a common Pakistani perspective, there is a lot of debate about American very little recognition of Pakistan's sacrifices in war on terror. So your comments on this, and two little questions. One is, did Pakistan and its leadership was really on board during the OBL operation? And this question might strike you that, did Pakistan ever stood against US national interest in this whole history of unstable relationship in this, particularly in this war on terror? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, on the last question, yes, because Pakistan accommodated and supported groups that were crossing the border from Pakistan to Afghanistan to attack and kill American soldiers and to destabilize the war that the United States was trying to stabilize. So that was the central problem from the American perspective. The second question, or the first one about the Pakistani sacrifices in the war, I think is an important one, and it was what I tried to allude to, in my earlier talk about how the war destabilized Pakistan and what a price Pakistan paid for that. It wasn't the intention of the United States to flush Al Qaeda out and have them go into Pakistan and start car bombing Pakistani cities and to go to war against the Pakistani state, but it was the result of the American invasion. And from a Pakistani perspective, when the Americans would come in 2010, 2011, and bang on the table, do more about the Haqqanis, do more about the Taliban leadership. And the Pakistanis would look around and say, do you not see the smoke on the horizon? I mean, I am at war with my own militants. And one of the things that Kayani was always saying to the Americans during this period was, I cannot afford to take actions that tip my war against my own domestic Taliban from 98% against 2% to 50-50, because then the state is going to collapse. I am trying to control this war so that we can win it and we can keep public opinion on our side. And it was a serious crisis. I mean, you may not remember in 2009, spring of 2009, when the Pakistani Taliban came pouring out of SWAT and started running on towards Islamabad. I mean, there was a genuine sense in Washington the state might collapse. They fought back. Gradually they regained control, but really it was only in 2015, if you look at the numbers, that the Pakistani forces were able to get terrorism back to a level that it had been domestically, in say 2004, 2005, and even then 500 civilians died in 2015, 2016. So, that's part of the 360 degrees perspective that I think, you need to bring to this if you're trying to figure out what it means and where to go from here. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.